In 1937, steelworkers launched the Little Steel Strike to challenge unsafe working conditions and anti-union practices, testing the limits of New Deal labor reforms. This violent altercation exposed the gap between federal labor laws and their enforcement during the Great Depression. Although the strike failed, the reaction to the strike called for reform from the government, who, through the Wagner Act and the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, would revolutionize the workforce. Persistent unsafe working conditions, low pay, and employer abuses permitted by Herbert Hoover's rugged individualism during the 1920s pushed workers towards unionization, setting the stage for a revolution in workers' rights. Workers typically labored for 60 to 80 hours a week without any benefits, such as retirement, insurance, and paid vacation. The work was very tiresome, as the laborers spent extended periods of time in high-temperature environments. These unsafe working conditions and gaps in workers' protections left the employees and their families vulnerable. In addition, the Supreme Court had often struck down labor regulations, arguing that they interfered with states' rights or private businesses. In 1918, the Supreme Court ruled on Hammer v. Dagenhart, a case that dealt with the Keating-Owen Act, ruling this legislation regarding child labor reform was unconstitutional. This cemented the government's laissez-faire approach to the economy, allowing workplace abuses to continue. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, promising to fix the nation's hardships through relief, recovery, and reform to those affected by the Great Depression. This New Deal signaled a major shift in government policy away from hands-off, business-centered beliefs.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
In 1935, Congress passed the Wagner Act, guaranteeing workers the legal right to form unions and bargain collectively. The law was intended to reduce conflict by giving workers a voice in the workplace. As a result, unionization spread to most of the private sector, propelled by a group called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. This included 80,000 of the 186,000 steelworkers in Cleveland, Youngstown, and Chicago who worked for U.S. Steel, also known as Big Steel, the largest steel manufacturer in the U.S., and Little Steel, a conglomeration of smaller steel companies. While reaction to the Wagner Act was positive for workers, the National Association of Manufacturers denounced the new law as unconstitutional, and the American Liberty League, a bipartisan political organization formed by conservative business leaders and politicians, issued a lengthy brief advising employers to disregard it. By the spring of 1937, tensions between steelworkers and management had progressed. Nowhere was this resistance more intense than in the little steel companies, particularly at Republic Steel's Cleveland plant, where corporate opposition turned federal labor reform into violent confrontation. By March 2, 1937, the CIO signed an agreement with Big Steel to unionize their factories. This gave hope to steelworkers at the Little Steel conglomerate, hoping for similar reform. However, many Little Steel companies reacted to the announcement by refusing to recognize the union or improve working conditions. During the Great Depression, many factories went out of business or had to reduce their workforce, making it undesirable to recognize unions. As a reaction to the proposed unionization, Republic Steel fired thousands of union supporters and publicly rejected collective bargaining. Instead of recognizing unions, Little Steel companies prepared for battle, donating weapons and money to the police, buying poison gas, and firing hundreds of union workers. Republic Steel purchased over $50,000 worth of tear gas to supply the Chicago police. They also supplied police with thousands of dollars worth of weapons, such as rifles and clubs, and helped fund the police to increase their forces near their plant. They also used undercover spies to monitor workers and helped the police arrest workers that were unionizing. These actions created fear among workers and made it clear that attempting to unionize was dangerous and could lead to harm. The federal government, through the Department of Labor, tried to mediate the dispute, but Little Steel executives resisted, with Republic Steel Chairman Tom Girdler stating, "I'll go back to the farm and dig potatoes before I sign with the CIO." The Little Steel strike officially began on May 26, 1937, when the Steelworkers Organizing Committee and the CIO called a strike against the Little Steel companies because they refused to recognize unionization. Workers walked off their jobs and formed picket lines outside of steel plants, especially at Republic Steel facilities in Chicago, Massillon, and Youngstown, Ohio, where thousands of strikers gathered at the factory gates to block strikebreakers from entering. By May of 1937, the situation had escalated into full revolution. Across the Great Lakes region, the Little Steel strike spread to 29 different plants, which involved nearly 80,000 workers. Clashes between the strikers and the police turned violent, with tear gas being used on innocent workers and the National Guard sent in to restore order, but things did not go as planned. Instead, tensions continued to rise, and the violence soon reached its peak. On Sunday, May 30th, 1937, around 2,000 workers and their families gathered in South Chicago with the goal of marching to the plant. As they traveled down the road, police claimed they were attacked by the mob and opened fire on unarmed Republic Steelworkers and their families. 10 workers were killed and 30 were seriously injured, with many of them being shot in the back while trying to run.
This scene takes place momentarily after a lens change showing the police firing their guns, clubbing the pickets, shooting tear gas. There was a tear gas bomb streaming through the air. If you look closely, you can see the police with their guns in their hand, some of them firing into the backs of the pickets as they struggled to run away from the police.
A U.S. Senate investigation found that the march had been peaceful and the use of police brutality was unnecessary, with Senator La Follette and his committee concluding that the consequences of the Memorial Day encounter were clearly avoidable by the police. These findings revealed that the police's reaction to the strike was intentional in its brutality and could, quote, invite the repetition of similar incidents in the future, showing how weak the enforcement for the Wagner Act really was. While many workers at these Little Steel plants supported the strike, the factory owners and police felt threatened by these actions, leading to police brutality and violence towards strikers. Local authorities prioritized maintaining order and protecting business interests over enforcing federal labor laws. When police intervened on behalf of factory owners, peaceful strikes quickly turned into brutal confrontations. These scenes shocked the nation. Newsreels and photographs showed workers being beaten and shot simply for exercising rights they were supposedly guaranteed by federal law. The strike made it painfully clear that when local governments sided with corporate interests, workers' rights could be ignored or crushed with little consequence. The Little Steel Strike of 1937 was significant because it exposed the limitations of New Deal labor protection. Outraged by the events of the Little Steel Strike, President Roosevelt pushed for major reforms, even calling for a constitutional amendment to protect workers. In response to this, Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. This established federal standards such as minimum wage, limits on child labor, and maximum working hours, while strengthening enforcement of the Wagner Act's protections for unions. Additionally, it strengthened the federal government's role in enforcing labor protections, reducing the ability of individual states or companies to undermine workers' rights. This shift towards stronger federal authority was soon reinforced by key Supreme Court decisions. In 1941, the Supreme Court heard United States v. Darby Lumber Company, a case directly tied to the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. The Supreme Court upheld the Act's minimum wage and maximum hour provisions, as well as explicitly rejecting similar limits on federal power. In doing so, the justices confirmed that Congress had broad authority to regulate labor conditions nationwide. This ruling cemented the federal government's role as a protector of workers' rights, union rights, and the expanded federal regulation of labor and industry. In addition, this ruling also signified major change in the Supreme Court's perspective on government interference. This ruling differed significantly from previous rulings that were in favor of businesses and laissez-faire policies. The legacy of the Little Steel Strike reaches well beyond the 1930s. While the strike itself ended in defeat, the brutality surrounding it forced the nation to confront the gap between legal promises and reality. It reformed labor law for the future, influenced landmark Supreme Court rulings, and revolutionized power between workers, employers, and the federal government.